Well, welcome to As Time Goes By. I'm Rich O'Brien. I'm your host, and over the last several weeks, about a month apart, we've been looking at looking back at the history of Lawrence, a look back at the history of Lawrence, and we've taken parts 1 and 2 and put those before you, and today we're going to take a look at part 3 from about the turn of the century, so stay tuned. Well, welcome back. We're going to take a look at the period of time with Steve Jansen beginning at about the turn of the century and going up to about World War II. Right. I think we can accomplish that today.
We'll hope.
And then we may be able to go further a little later on.
Great.
Steve, the people were full of anticipation, weren't they? I mean, here you are ready to turn the century. I mean, there's something psychological about that.
Right.
We're about to do it here,
right,
in our time. Now, here they were in Lawrence, Kansas, looking into the 1900s. What was going on?
Well, they were very hopeful that they'd have, for one thing, paved roads. If you can imagine the difference between, they had been wrestling with muddy streets between 1854 and 1900, and they were firmly on track, they thought, to finally laying brick on Massachusetts Street. So they'd have hard surface roads. And they just had recently, within the last 10 years or so, built a Union Pacific depot, which we're now going to turn into a visitor information center over in North Lawrence. And so they were feeling as though Lawrence was finally coming into its own as a community. The University of Kansas was about 1,000 students, and they thought that was just wonderful, remarkable growth, and they were very pleased at the growth of the university. Haskell was probably in the range of 1,500 to 2,000 students. They were hoping that now perhaps they might have electric streetcars coming, because if you have hard surfaced roads, then you can have electric streetcars.
I suspect at this time too they may have been thinking we're going to be sort of a center of culture in America, and you know, we're right in the middle of the country, or at least in this as people traverse westward.
Right. Well, they took great pride in the amount of literary activities, and the things that came to the Bowersock Opera House were very important to them. The university, of course, is identified with a fine library and with the development of intellectual pursuits, and so they saw that as a blossoming of the Athens of Kansas, or the Athens of the West.
Yeah, the Athens.
Right.
Yeah. Looking back to the hard surface roads now, as you were going on.
Right.
It had to be a brick road, though, didn't it? There were no, at this point, there was no asphalt lanes.
No, that's part of what we do develop
a little
here.
later?
Right. And a man named Henley with the American Cement Plaster Company building, which is ironically just across the street from Sunflower Cablevision. You're located on the northeast corner, and on the southwest corner across the street is the American Cement Plaster Company building. And but they had experimented in the 1870s with wood, and in fact taxed budding property owners. And ironically, much like in the Great Fire of Chicago, there was a fire, and the wood streets turned into flames, and after a couple of years, the wood sunk into the mud and was covered over by the dirt. But they were, I mean, today, I don't think our worst country road today is better than their best urban road in many cases.
How did they do that with wood? I don't know if you're a
Well,
contractor.
they took 16 inches square of cottonwood, dipped it in creosote, we'd call it, or in an oil tar mix, and then brought it out and then laid it together. So they were attempting to create a kind of an oil tar mix using wood as the basic element. The problem here is we don't have enough cobblestone or the right kind of stone like you would find in New England or in other places of the country or in Europe. So they did have a tremendous problem coming up with a material that they could produce in the quantity. I mean, eventually, to give you an example, with brick, they tried for 20 years to get an outside developer to come in and lay the brick streets. Nobody would come because Lawrence was too small a community. So eventually, they formed a Lawrence Vitrified Brick Company, in whom the major stockholders were the major wealthy people of Lawrence. Well, on the city commission, or city council is what they had, their form of government, were many of the major wealthy people. So today we'd call it a conflict of interest, because literally the right hand was creating a 20-year agreement with the Vitrified Brick Company to buy X thousands of bricks. But that was the only way they could get the streets paved. So I mean, our standards today, it would be disreputable. But that in effect accomplished the objective of
but looking
paving
back,
the
you can hardly
streets.
blame them. I mean, you could say that they really did have the interest of the city.
They did, and when you realize how much it reflected badly on a community to not have paved streets, they felt as though it was a real coming-of-age issue.
Well, you bring up a point. Did people coming west put a lot of stock in whether a community they might come to would have paved streets? Was that a real factor?
Probably the most important factor was rail transportation, and Lawrence was favored very definitely with the Santa Fe and the Union Pacific. To give you another example of their life, 25 times a day on the Union Pacific, 25 times a day in the Santa Fe going east, 25 times a day going west on the Union Pacific, 25 times a day going west on the Union Pacific. So 50 times a day in one direction, so a total of 100 times a day, trains stopped here and picked up passengers.
Incredible.
You know, when we talk about transportation choices, we forget that we had the world's best passenger railroad service, in Kansas being such a large state, had a great railroad system with very close connections to Eudora and Baldwin City and McLouth and the surrounding communities. And so Lawrence had that rail transportation. But then you started looking at issues like, do you have electricity? Do you have telephones? Do you have paved streets? And what kind of schools does your community offer? And Lawrence was a very important attraction. Initially, the university had attracted high school students. And then they said, no, you can't come to the university anymore unless you have the diploma in hand.
We were saying that.
Right. And then that meant that Lawrence High Schools boomed, because if you wanted to make sure your child in western Kansas could qualify the University of Kansas, why not move to town or send your child to Lawrence? So there would be a 10, 15, 20% of Lawrence High graduates who were from elsewhere, because they knew that if they graduated from Lawrence High, they'd be ready to go to KU.
Sure.
Right.
The century turns. We now have paved streets, or at least we have brick streets, I guess. Now what happens to that spirit of enthusiasm for a new century?
Well, ironically, they were tested very quickly by the Great Flood of 1903, which came roaring through down the Kansas River. And the 1951 flood later is worse in terms of height of water, but when you realize how little they had to fight the 1903 flood with, in terms of power-driven equipment to bail out basements and all sorts of things.
A lot better off in 51.
Right, right. And then the 03 flood tore into the riverbank industrial complex, took the flour mill literally off of its foundation and carried it downstream. A house comes into North Lawrence, and the present bridge across the Kansas River is twice the length that it was in 1903, because the house came in 1903 into the north bank, the water's pushing behind it, and it dug out a new channel on the north side. And so literally after the 1903 flood, they had to build a temporary bridge out to hook up to the old bridge and then come across to Lawrence. So when they build the Victory Bridge in 1917, it is actually twice as long as the original bridge had been in 1864.
Do you know if there were any fatalities in that 03 flood?
Oh, there was, I guess there were some deaths. Gadali Graber, a veteran riverman, he knew how to traverse the river. And he's said to have brought across 25,000 people over the course of those weeks, bringing them back and forth across the river from North Lawrence. all of North Lawrence was completely inundated with water. In other words, if people can remember the early 1990s when the water started coming up close to the levee, that is built up probably 15 to 25 feet higher than what they had. So the waters came pouring through, and they remembered an Indian, Delaware Indian from 1844, who'd remembered a flood of 1844 where the waters from the North Kansas River bluffs all the way to Baldwin City was supposedly the whole valley had been underwater. Wow. And that's what the 1903 flood made them think of. And then there was a tornado in 1911. And think about that issue. You know, we have now so many ways of being alerted to bad weather. In 1911, it's a stormy night. I mean, you literally have no warning that it's coming. And the downtown was decimated by that. And in a community that's only growing by 5 or 10% every 10 years, that's a tremendous blow, the 1903 flood and then the 1911 tornado. That really hurts the community for a period of time.
How badly was the downtown area hit by, or the town of Lawrence hit by the tornado?
Well, the tornado came through and it tore down a part of the Eldridge Hotel and then came into the 600 block where, Liberty Hall is today, the Free State Brewery, the Journal World Warehouse.
Well, it's in the middle of everything.
Right, and then it completely decimated that whole block, which was an industrial warehouse factory area. So it's very important to the town, and it took, I mean, it literally takes years or decades for the town to recover.
I was going to ask that question, just how long did it take for businesses to get back on track?
You know, there is insurance. I mean, people do take out insurance, and there is the ability to recover. But you don't have the federal government playing the disaster role that we would expect today. And Red Cross is in its formative stage, and it's not immediately at hand either. So people are much more dependent upon their own local efforts, and there's not the outside agencies to come in.
Except maybe somebody who'll come in and sell you something you don't want.
Right, and there's always that, then and now, right.
Right. So 1911 takes us up to, well, we're getting close to the big D.
Right.
Things are going to happen economically in the whole country.
Right.
How drastic will that be for this Lawrence community?
You mean the Depression?
The Depression.
Right. Well, First World War I comes, and that sort of changes.
Right. I remember the war.
Yeah, right.
That
changes.
Forgot a little war.
Well, a little war, yeah. But it was a tremendous. America's finally going out of its sort of isolationism in Lawrence and Douglas County residents are being sent across to Europe, and there's a tremendous impact on Lawrence because you remember we talked before about how 20% of the community was German born. And so people who'd always been accepted in this community all of a sudden are hit by the impact of World War I. Wiedemann's, Wagstaff's, Dykman's, there were many Obers, Ernst, there are many German names up and down the streets of Lawrence and on Massachusetts Street. The Turnverein still sits today at 9th and Rhode Island, and for this community all of a sudden to have its loyalty questioned leads to a suicide by a prominent businessman named William Wiedemann, who goes and borrows a gun from Phil Ernst and walks behind his store and shoots himself and leaves a note blaming propaganda, and he cites all the things he'd done to prove. Cassold, which we now think of as a street name, was the name of the man who ran the West End Grocery. He had his grocery painted yellow, and so the German Americans in this community, all of a sudden German is no longer taught at Lawrence High, and so there's profound effects as a result of that, and that was a lingering, it was a sudden quick slap in the face for German Americans because they hadn't encountered much discrimination.
Steve, we'll come back in a minute and find out how well they did.
Okay, good.
Okay, stay with us. We'll be back after this with more of our history in Lawrence. Well, welcome back to As Time Goes By, talking to Steve Jansen. We're talking about the history of Lawrence and Douglas County and looking back, we looked back, clear back to the beginning. Now we're up to World War II and, I'm sorry, World War I and the displacement of the Germans here, really, and the wrangle through which they went. How did they get out of this? How did they recover?
Well, thank goodness the war ends, and then eventually people return to their pre-war normalities, if you will, but it had a lingering effect. I mean, I don't know how long it was before German was taught again in Lawrence schools, and it changed German Americans' pride in their country, home country, and they became more and more vigilant about trying to prove that they were American. And this was a big adjustment. I mean, one of our local historians, Elfrida Fischer-Rowe, who was of German descent, talked about how that affected particularly the older people, because they'd always been able to be German and be American.
And they still had the accents,
right,
and so the rest of it?
The children, of course, grow up very quickly and learn that to speak German is not going to help them get ahead in America. So the second and third generations tend to make the transition to being more and more Americanized.
Isn't that amazing? Because now we have German-American clubs and organizations, and it's fine, even after going through 2 wars. With the Germans.
Right.
It's interesting. Along about that same time, the same time of the war,
right,
was this horrible scourge where I guess thousands of people died.
Well, probably hundreds of thousands.
Perhaps so.
Right.
And the great, what they call the Great Flu Epidemic
right,
of 1918.
Right. And this is a terrible thing. It affects Lawrence and Douglas County. There were more deaths than births for at least a couple of years, and that was just unheard of, and particularly older people who were deeply affected by it. And it comes, of course, as you know, no vaccinations, no viruses to protect yourself against that you're aware of, and the exposure to people to what we today would be able to deal with, but because it's a new phenomenon, it's a tremendous challenge.
Today it's a disease, it's a discomfort.
Right, right.
And
but not a life-threatening disease.
Not life-threatening. Everybody gets through. But in those days, I guess if a person came down with the flu, it was just you look for the worst.
But these shock waves, in a sense, create the impetus for us to develop sewers, to develop a clean, reliable water system, to develop a greater reliance upon clean medical hospitals where environments can be controlled. So those
are the impetus to develop.
Right, right.
And it develops a hardy stock too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because you have to fight your way through.
Survive, right? Yeah.
So we hit the war ends.
Right.
And we know that we came out of that one. Now where do we go?
Well, I think I want to, so that people will know that I do know occasionally numbers, and I'm not just gross generalities. In 1910, total population of Lawrence was 12,374. In 1920, it's only grown by less than 100, 12,456.
In 10 years.
In 10 years. And by 1930, it's up to 13,726. And then 1940, where we're headed, it's 14,390. So that's very slow growth. Lawrence, Kansas that we know today is 2% growth a year. And we're looking at between 1910 and 1920, 0.7%. Between 1920 and 1930, 10.2% for the whole decade. And then from 1930 to 1940, 4.8%. And so that's, and then, you know, KU grows to in 1925, it's 5,400 students. And then by 1940, it's back down to 4,300. So actually the Depression, to give you an example, between 1925 and 1935, no new buildings were built on the University of Kansas campus except those paid for by Elizabeth Miller Watkins. That is Miller Scholarship Hall, Watkins Scholarship Hall, the original Watkins University Hospital. Because of the agricultural depression of Kansas,
there's no
and faculty salaries are cut back by 25% during that time period of the 1930s. And so tremendous. I mean, Lawrence's main industry then and now is the university, so that was a big hit.
Steve, as a historian, looking back on that Depression, I've heard it said that, and I'm asking you the question, I've heard it said that this may have made America capable of going, for instance, into World War II with the kind of devotion, commitment that it had because of the
lessons of discipline.
Lessons of discipline and sacrifice. Yeah. Is that, do you
well,
see that
I mean,
historically?
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, historians tend to, and sociologists tend to talk about rising expectations, and clearly that knocked down a lot of expectations, and it made people willing to adjust to whatever was available, and in that sense created a flexibility and a versatility that stood them in good stead during the war.
Did Lawrence go through the so-called Roaring '20s too, as it came toward that Depression? Because it seems as almost as if it were sort of Mardi Gras type of thing, you know, where everybody partied and then slam.
The only problem about partying in Lawrence, Kansas is we're a dry state now. We talked last time about how dryness is a little bit contingent on who you know and whether you want to go and knock on the door and whether you are familiar with the bootleggers. And of course that was the case in the 20s, but it doesn't have the out front presence here that we might think of in the Chicago style or Miami or someplace where it was wide open. Well, this town is never wide open in that sense. But there is an impact here. I mean, people knew when those beer trucks came in from Kansas City with Missouri license plates and rolled down the alleys and stopped in front of garages. And men took off boxes and put them in the garages. People knew
something was
going on, right? And so, I mean, it's again the issue of if enough people want to do something, they will punish those who do it blatantly and openly, but they will, in a sense, create a certain amount of tolerance.
But at the very least, that period from about the end of the war, World War I, up to the crash in '29, was a very high living period, wasn't it, nationwide? And would that include Lawrence?
Well, Lawrence, you know, if you're only growing less than 5% during that whole decade, it's a Lawrence of 12 to 14,000 people, with the University of Kansas still on the southwest edge of town. But it has a streetcar system that it comes in 1909, and then by 1935 you can go. The statistic is that by 1925, 80% of Lawrence's population lived within 2 blocks of a public transportation system. If we could say that today, what kind of a Lawrence would we have? So and then if you think of that, the railroads are still continuing full-fledged passenger service. So there's a transportation alternative. You could ride the Kansas City interurban from Lawrence, Kansas, 12 times a day into Kansas City, stay there as late as midnight, come back on the interurban and arrive at Lawrence. And on football game days, they'd let the interurban switch onto the Lawrence streetcars, and it got within a block of the football stadium. So when you think about those kind of things, there's a real
advantage.
Amount of
class, and the lifestyle, which would in the 30s, of course, be slapped down. Must have been considerably higher during the 20s.
Oh yeah, there was a well-to-do parents.
There was an optimistic look at things too.
But in a sense, automobiles, which we think of today as sort of everybody's requirement to be alive, that's something that's a status symbol. That's something that would be associated with those who have wealth and are middle class and upper middle class. So maybe today would be the personal home computer. In the 1920s and 1930s, it was either owning or having access to an automobile.
Yeah. So we're headed into 1941. That's how far we'd like to get in this program today. What was the picture there during that period? We got a couple of minutes. From the time we left the Depression, kind of recovers from the Depression, Roosevelt becomes president. How is Lawrence and Douglas County affected up to the war?
Some of the things we see today, like Pinckney School, the water tower that's up close to the University Stadium, the paving, as opposed to bricks. They paved Massachusetts Street. They paved much of Old West Lawrence. So there's a real infusion of dollars into the local economy as a result of the Public Works Administration and the WPA. Haskell continues to grow because it is a federal source, and there are monies that go there. The university is a very slow growing entity. I mean, but it's developing a love affair.
I tell you what, let's do. We're just out of time here. We'll have you back in a few weeks and actually start pre-war. We'll start in this period as you're talking about where the paving comes from. I couldn't help but think that now people want brick streets.
Now we're taking it off and going back to
sort of a status symbol to have those things back. But we'll have you back, if you will.
You bet.
And go from there and see if we can make it clear to the 21st century. What do you think?
Thank you very much.
Hey, this is great. I'm learning so much about the town and about the area. And about our country, because there's a lot of what happens in the country is tied up in this too. Yeah. Steve Jansen, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining us, and of course we'll be back next week with another edition of As Time Goes By.